During the 1800s, people were rapidly creating railroads across America. There was a great expansion in the lumber business during this time, especially in the Northeast states. As more and more railroads began to establish, small towns had to be created. Railroad builders needed to rapidly transport timber along the West Coast. In the 1860s, a new term came into being, a skid road, named for the greasy roads that workers used to transport logs to the small towns along the railroads. These railroads aided the immigrants in their exploration through America for opportunity. Along with immigrants, drunken men from the local saloon often ended up on the side of the railroads with no family, shunned by society. In 1914, Tom Lydco opened the Midnight Mission, which served dinner to crowds of homeless men at midnight. Mr. Lydco called this area of downtown Hell's Half Acre. The term Skid Road was not used until the Great Depression struck and people were figuratively slipping down the skids of society. As downtown began to develop as an industrial city, homeless people encountered a significant level of poverty within their communities. In order to keep optimism and harmony throughout their lives, many of the communities explored their creative abilities by exchanging and encouraging artistic ideas amongst themselves. In the 1970s, as the Vietnam War came to an end, many veterans came back to America with no homes or money left to support them. Many of them ended up on the streets and still are today. In 1975, the government adopted a redevelopment plan which included a policy of containment. This is the moment when Skid Row began not to be only a place for the homeless, but an area that the government decided would be the best place to stuff all of the homeless citizens of Los Angeles.
They'll probably keep a couple homeless people just to show people what it kind of is.
The government's intentions were if the homeless were out of sight, they would also be out of mind. This concentration was not only inhumane, but also unsanitary and dangerous. Social service agencies and shelters were all located in this 154-block fraction of downtown. By the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan established a new economic policy under the name of trickle-down economics, or Reaganomics. The goal of this Reaganomics was to lower taxes for the rich in order to give the rich the opportunity to use their money for a better cause, such as supporting the lower classes. At the same time, the government was stripped of their own money and had to cut back on funding for social services such as shelters and mental health facilities for the homeless. Wages also decreased following the 1980s tax cuts. Although this policy had good intentions, it was devastating for not only the economy, but also a very large fraction of society. By the end of the 1980s, 30% of the population was living on the streets. The grand hotels of the Gilded Age that once welcomed famous faces such as Charlie Chaplin and Woodrow Wilson were now housing the poorest citizens of Los Angeles. Currently, Skid Row is home to thousands of homeless people. But as more middle-class people begin moving into the nearby lofts and apartments, the homeless people of Skid Row are getting restricted, pushed down, and hidden even more within their community. Gentrification is the process of renewal and rebuilding accompanying the influx of middle-class or affluent people into deteriorating areas that often displaces poorer residents.
First started hanging out around the Skid Row area back in the late 90s. Back then it was more like deserted. It's just everything was closed, gated, forgotten.
Gentrification is now so rapidly increasing that there have been 23,000 new residents in merely the past 7 years. Art is a great way for people to exchange their ideas within these hardships of oppression and poverty. Many of the organizations that help the homeless with housing and necessities also hold art workshops and help support homeless artists' love for expressing themselves.
I ask them to look inside themselves and see what moves them to paint. I like for them to work from their imagination. And I've had some wonderful art come out when I ask them to draw from their imagination and paint from their imagination.
A few of these organizations are the LAMP Community and Rivers Housing Corporation. Both of these organizations are located right in the heart of Skid Row and are very welcoming and open-minded to the public. Also, a more modern version of the Midnight Mission is The Nickel, a nice little restaurant on the corner of 5th and Main.
Coming across like old frames at a secondhand store, like old beat up canvases with a bunch of layers of acrylic. We'll just paint them over, with a buff paint, like whatever we had, and then draw on top of that.
Art and compassion are things that keep this community continuing to survive. There are so many artists that have lived on the streets or in housing communities who do whatever they have to do, wherever they have to do it in order to get their thoughts and ideas across to the public.
This man told me once, your life is like a canvas, you paint on it what you want. So I gotta paint what I want on my canvas. If I don't like what I'm painting, I gotta take it out.
Art boosts confidence, encourages creativity and happiness, and gives these homeless citizens a feeling of control over their own lives by doing something that they know they love.
To admit it's getting better.